So, listeners, this is Race to Zero, a different kind of outrage and optimism, and therefore we have different music. Now, guys, have you heard the new music?
Clay hasn't let me hear it, actually. He said I'll hear it when listeners hear it.
I've heard it. It's absolutely brilliant. Listen up. Here we go. Race to Zero. Buckle up. Race to Zero.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Hello and welcome to Outrage and Optimism. I'm Tom Rivett-Carnac.
I'm Cristiana Figueres.
And I'm Paul Dickinson.
Welcome to our Race to Zero series. This is the first episode in which we will explore the road to COP26, the Race to Zero, and how this is the year that we are going to deal with the climate crisis. Thanks for being here. So this is it, the big year, everybody, the countdown to COP26. We've got an international government process. We've got a race to zero. We're going to dig into that. But I just want to start with what's at stake, because I don't know about you guys, but in the last week, what I've seen is a UNFCCC synthesis report that says we're nowhere on track with national commitments, and an additional report that came out today from the IEA that pointed out that emissions went up in 2020 after all. What's going on? This isn't how it was supposed to happen.
No, it's like the cars are moving in the wrong direction of the race, right? Whoa, wait a minute. U-turn here. This is totally the wrong direction. So yeah, two reports, one after the other with very bad news. So what does it take? You know, what is the information that is being reflected by those reports, and what can change both on the part of governments as well as on the part of everyone else? Civil society, finance institutions, corporations, everyone has got to get moving, in fact, flying in the right direction, which is toward decarbonizing. And that is one of the very important goals of COP26 for everyone to come to show. It's a show and tell. How much have we decarbonized and how much more are we going to decarbonize in the next 5 to 10 years? Those commitments are absolutely key to having any chance of addressing climate change in a timely fashion.
Okay, well, let me tell you girls what I think is at the heart of this, because I've actually been taught by Christiana how it works. So here's the thing. The governments are all going to come to the COP with their nationally determined contributions. Okay, this is the stock take after 5 years. How much have they raised their ambition to decarbonize societies quickly so we can all stay well under 2 degrees, under 1.5 degrees? So here's the thing. It's not about Glasgow. In November this year. It's actually about us all taking action right now. And I mean right now, like in February, in March, in April. Actually, February was last month, but you know what I mean. In March, in April, in May, in June, July, August, September. We want to put the most enormous pressure on all the governments in the world to say, come on, this is like the Olympics for governments. Are you going to turn up and you're going to like run 100 meters in 4 minutes? No, you're going to organize your society, you're going to make your policies, you're going to put together your commitments, and you're going to come and you're going to show the world how you can lead, you can build the industries of the future, you can be the best government in the world, and top marks, special gold stars, special medals given for collaborating with other governments to bring in policy regimes that protect our children. Thank you.
So did Paul Dickinson just explain to Christiana Figueres how international diplomacy works? And if he did, then Christiana, I want to know how he did. What's his marks out of 10?
You know, not bad, as you would say in the UK.
Our little Paul Dickinson's all grown up.
Yeah, he's all grown up.
I'm blushing, actually.
And not only did he get the gist of it, the heart of it, but he explained it in a way that is actually very, very understandable to all of us. And that's really important, right? Because we can't continue to speak in gibberish that nobody understands. So thank you, Paul. Brilliant job.
So your brilliant explanation, what it pointed to there is that this year is about Governments coming forward and everyone else coming forward as well. This has to be everyone, everywhere. All the commitment on the table, all of the ambition, and we need to get our arms around all of that. The national government process is the process that is leading up to COP26, and everything else is the race to zero. And that's what we're here to delve into today.
And just before you tell us who we're going to be talking to, I personally think, we've got... it's pretty clear what we need. Like, we need government policy, right? We need lots of incentives and schemes. The Stern and Stiglitz, these two economists, saying we need $100 a ton. And we need policies.
We've never had Nick Stern on this podcast. Jesus, sorry, that's a bit of an aside. Carry on, Paul.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's just kind of real life programming in real time. Oh, it's just occurred to me that whilst I'm broadcasting to millions of people, we'll just interrupt Paul with my latest idea.
Sorry,
what's wrong with a pen? What's wrong with a pen? You just write it down, Anyway, sorry. I'm just in full flow.
Nick Stern, if you're listening, we'd like to have you on the podcast.
Okay, so look,
Paul,
long story short, $100 a ton, policies. Let's get that government regulation in place, and then we'll fix this problem. Christiana is smiling because she's going to make fun of us. Come off mute, Christiana.
You're on mute.
No, I'm laughing because I think real life programming actually has a lot to say for it. And the fact that Paul did not get distracted and was able to complete his sentence speaks very highly
impressive.
of Paul.
Calling Nick Stern. Right, Tom, what's on the show?
Well, we have some amazing guests for you today. We have taken the last week. We're recording
wait. Before we go there,
Yeah.
I think it would be a good thing to explain what the race to zero is, which is actually two concepts that are being brought together. Let me start with the second. The second is the zero, race to zero, right? What does zero mean? Because frankly, when you think of zero, it sort of has a negative connotation. In this case, it has a very positive connotation. The zero means that we know from science, and it has already been embedded into the Paris Agreement, that we have to be at zero net emissions by 2050. So that's where the zero comes from. Well, the Paris Agreement actually says in the second half of the century. Now we're pulling that forward because science has become more granular and more critical.
Right.
But yes, so by 2050 at the latest.
Yeah.
But like the climate pledge says, 2040 is even better. But that's where the zero is. The zero is about zero net emissions. And the race piece, because it's called Race to Zero, is there to remind us that timing is really important. If there's one factor that is absolutely critical about climate change, is time. Because 1 ton emitted today has much more negative effect on climate change than 1 ton emitted 5 years from now because of the cumulative nature of greenhouse gases. So it is a race. It is a race against time. We used to say, swallow the alarm clock, if you remember in the good old days. Swallow the alarm clock, because this really is a race. So that's why it is called a race to zero. And that is why it is part of this journey toward COP26 to have under the big umbrella of Race to Zero everything that civil society, corporations, cities, everyone who is not a national government will be covered by the Race to Zero effort.
Awesome.
Okay, so so we've got the governments that are getting there ready for Paris, and the Race to Zero is
I think
everybody.
Glasgow. Not getting
Good
ready
point.
for Paris.
Yeah,
Okay,
no,
yeah.
just checking there. Sometimes your interruptions are annoying. Sometimes they're actually very helpful because I'm talking rubbish. So look, yeah, we've got the governments getting ready towards Glasgow, but we've also got, you brushed over it, but I just really want to emphasize for the listeners, corporations, investors, cities, states, regions, civil society. I mean, it's just extraordinary. Like we're all in this together, and that's so exciting that we can be kind of united under a single brand, a single concept.
So invigorating.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay, so who's on?
So, in the course of the next 30 minutes, you are going to hear from Alok Sharma, the COP President-Designate, who will be the president of COP26 in Glasgow. Patricia Espinosa, the Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Christiana's successor. Nigel Topping, the UK's high-level champion for climate action. And from Anne Hitt, who for 10 years ran the Beyond Coal campaign in the US and is now the campaigns director for the Sierra Club. We learned a lot from these conversations, so let's head into them now. And at the end, we'll come back to you, Christiana and Paul, to sum it up. Here we go.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Alok, what a true delight and an honor to have you on our podcast. I've been thinking about what you bring to COP26 as a person, because I had the pleasure of working with quite a few COP presidents and noticed that although every single COP president has very similar terms of reference in terms of the multilateral role and the neutrality that has to be achieved, every COP president brings a very different background and experience to the job. And you are quite unique because you are definitely a UK citizen, but you were born in India. You were a development secretary. You have now just come from Gabon, Ethiopia, India, Nepal, Egypt. I am guessing, but I would love to hear from you, that all of this background has actually shaped your sense of adaptation, of resilience, of climate justice, all of those issues that, frankly, are at the heart of the global South position in a negotiation. Am I overreaching?
Christiana, you never overreach. Look, firstly, it's a great honor to be on this podcast. I'm really pleased to be here. And, I'm speaking to you from Paris. I've just had a really good meeting with Laurent Fabius, and tomorrow I'm having an opportunity to meet with a great friend of this podcast, Laurence Toubiana, as well.
That's the voice of the Right Honourable Alok Sharma MP, COP President-Designate. He will be overseeing the negotiations in Glasgow at the end of this year, and his role could not be more important.
We are all, at the end of the day, crafted by the experiences that we have through our career, through our life. The first trip I did almost a year ago, actually, in this role before I went full-time, was to New York, to the UN. And I met a lot of the perm reps. And I remember one particular meeting really vividly. And we were sitting with the perm reps from the small island developing states, from some of the developing nations, and we were going around the table, and I was asking each of them, what does climate change mean for you? And we got to the perm rep for one of the small island developing states, and she said, if we don't fix this, I'm not going to have a place to call home. And that was the point at which, very early on in this role, that it brought it home to me just how stark this is for very many people who weren't necessarily responsible for creating the situation we're in.
This year, 5 years after adopting the Paris Agreement, we meet its first test. Countries must increase their commitments to ensure that we can realise the goals of that agreement. As the UK is hosting the Conference of the Parties this year, Alok Sharma, as the President, is responsible for bringing nations together on climate this November in Glasgow. He's been to India, Nepal, Ethiopia, Gabon and Egypt in just the last few weeks, and today he's talking to us from Paris. Although a member of the UK government for a long time, in this role, he has to advocate on the part of everyone, all people, all countries, to build a unified action framework that shows collective progress. It's a tough job and an incredibly important one.
It's been a really difficult year. I mean, before I went full-time, I was the business minister in our government. And we deployed, along with lots of other governments around the world, significant financial support for businesses, for jobs, for people's livelihoods. And that was absolutely the right thing to do. But the interesting thing, I think, with this is that we are at this point where we're going to have to recover. And I think that actually, and you're seeing this in the statements that are being made by governments around the world, is that they have understood that the way you recover and the way you recover better is by doing it in a green and sustainable way. And I just look at the UK, and I'm sorry to be a bit parochial about this, but since I was part of some of our plans that we put together, which we announced last year. So we announced a plan for a green industrial revolution. And this was about ensuring that we were putting government money, leveraging in multiples of that from the private sector, and then creating very many tens of thousands of jobs in sunrise industries, those green jobs that we all want to see. And I think, for lots of people around the world, they will not be sort of focused, all the time on climate action issues. But I think what's important for us as part of the COP process and more generally is to connect with them and to demonstrate to people that actually having a green recovery, ensuring that our environment is getting better, is also consistent with an economic recovery and with value-added jobs, high productivity jobs in the future. And I just point at the UK, and other countries will have the same similar statistics, is that the last 30 years, we've managed to grow through successive governments, I would say, our economy by 75%, and yet we have cut emissions by 43%. I mean, green growth is absolutely possible, and I think that is what collectively through the G7, the G20, we all need to be pushing.
Getting behind a green recovery sounds like an excellent pathway to shift the pace of climate action. As you will have heard on this podcast previously, most economists have been concerned that recovery finance is not moving in a sufficiently green direction, and public support for doing so is vital. We've heard Joe Biden emphasize green recovery and job creation as he took office. But what does all this mean to ordinary people? Is the COP just a distant government process? Can it or should it be meaningful for everyone else?
We collectively, all of us, want this COP to be the most inclusive COP ever. And I know it's a high benchmark to set, but because we've had great COPs in the past. For me, that is really important. And so we've set up a number of advisory groups. We've got a civil society and youth advisory group. And civil society, I take my inspiration from civil society groups and youth groups that I meet around the world. I mean, I've just come back from Nepal, and meeting young people who are right at the forefront of climate action is so inspiring. But what is really important is that the advisory groups that we have, we need to make sure that they feel that they're having a real voice in how COP is put together, what we are trying to achieve on the road to COP. We've got a civil society youth advisory group. We've got two co-chairs, one young activist from the Global North, one from the Global South. And one of the first meetings we had, I think there was some skepticism where people said, well, is this, you just brought us together, it's just some sort of talking shop. And I was very clear that is not what we are doing. And we've got a ministerial meeting at the end of this month, looking at finance, looking at development. And civil society is going to be very much part of that conversation with donor countries and also developing countries. That they have to be part of this conversation if we're going to succeed.
This episode of Outrage and Optimism is the first in our series about the Race to Zero, this initiative that makes space for everybody to play their part on the road to Glasgow and to embolden governments to take meaningful action. It's not about 2 weeks in Glasgow in November. The road from here to there is vital, and it's where we're going to make the change. So how is Alok Sharma using his role to gather real momentum?
I think this question of what we do over the next 8 months is absolutely critical. And we have a number of big events coming up at leader level. Obviously, along the road, we will have the G7, which is presided over by the UK. And you've already seen some of the statements that have come out in terms of wanting to build back better and achieve a just transition and a green recovery. And we've got the G20, which of course is presided over by our Italian partners and friends who are co-hosting COP26 as well. And along the way, there will be a number of other events and summits that are coming up. And I think what we want to see is, if I can put it like this, the green thread of climate action and commitments coming through at those events. We've got the US is great to have them back in the front line in the fight against climate change. The US, of course, President Biden will be hosting an event at the end of April. And I'm looking forward to seeing, what commitments come forward there, both obviously from the US, but others as well. So it is building. And I hope if we're able to do that and we work closely together with partners around the world, we will get to a point where we will be able to have success at COP26. And what I would also say is that I think people are willing for COP26 to be a success. That's been one of the key takeaways from me on the visits that I have done this year to countries around the world. It doesn't matter where you go. Yes, people will have different views, but they are willing for this to be a success because they understand this matters so much for them and their populations and for the world and indeed for future generations.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share with you and with your audience some thoughts about COP26, which is, in my view, really the credibility test for humanity on the fight against climate change.
That's Patricia Espinosa, Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Patricia succeeded Christiana in this role and has to preside over the multilateral organization that oversees this first test of the Paris Agreement that marked the success of the previous Executive Secretary's role. Christiana asked her what she sees as the main keys to success on the road to COP26.
First of all, promises made must be promises kept. And that relates to mitigation goals, but it also relates to finance. It relates to finance to the 100 billion goal of resources to be mobilized to support developing countries that are not yet on the table. The next point would be raise ambitions and lower emissions. This year at COP, we need to see updated NDCs that really bring the world on a path that allows us to reach the goals by the Paris Agreement. We are not yet there. And this is very, very important. And the ambitions need to relate not only to mitigation, they have to relate also to adaptation and finance. It is one integrated agenda. And the last point would be that we need to get everybody's voice and everybody's contributions and solutions on board. We should not leave anybody behind. These are the 4 points that I deem absolutely necessary for a successful COP26.
Could I go back to your point number 2, which was raise ambition and lower emissions? Because the UNFCCC Secretariat has recently released your synthesis report, and I'm sure you were appalled, if I may put a word into your mouth, to see that currently we're only at 1% reduction by 2030 as compared to our 2010 levels. That is definitely not where we should be. The IPCC has said that we need to be at minimum at 45%, if not 50% by 2030. What do those numbers tell you?
Well, first of all, Christiana, it tells us that we really need to take decisions now. This is the year, this is the moment where we need to take decisions. It tells us that even though the NDC report is only a partial view because it does not cover all the parties to the Paris Agreement, and we are certainly hoping that in the next months we will have many more parties, including important big emitters, coming forward with very ambitious plans. In spite of that, it tells us that the feasibility, the likelihood of us seeing humanity on this clear path to the 1.5 degrees under the Paris Agreement is still not there. So I certainly hope that seeing this report early in the year will allow parties to really look at what else they can do in order to increase their ambitions, in order to increase their goals in their NDCs, so that we can have a better picture by November when we meet in Glasgow.
I think it just demonstrates to everyone that there is still a long way to go when it comes to those NDCs.
Back to Alok Sharma again.
You know, when I'm going around the world, I'm taking a very consistent message. And Christiana talked about some of the countries I've been to, I'll be doing more traveling. But it's a very consistent message, is that we want all countries to come forward with ambitious near-term emissions reductions targets, those NDCs by 2030, to sign up to net zero. I mean, the good news when it comes to net zero is that over the past year, we've seen a real move. So 70% of the world economy is now covered by a net zero target, which is very good news. But actually, what also really matters are those near-term targets of 2030 to show that you're on the pathway. And that's been one of the key messages, as well as on finance and adaptation.
So that's where the Race to Zero comes in. Translating pledges and goals into concrete decisions today is the only way to make sure the 2030, 2040 and 2050 goals are possible. Patricia Espinosa explains why.
First of all, to say that the Race to Zero is really expresses very clearly the willingness of those who are making these pledges to become carbon neutral by 2050 to be aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement. So I think that's very, very, very important. Of course, what we need to see still is those pledges being reflected in the immediate plans, in the immediate policies, immediate decisions that need to be taken. So this applies, of course, to countries, to governments, but it also applies to private sector. Okay, if you, with your company, are making a pledge to become carbon neutral by 2050, then what are you going to do today? How does it match with the decisions that you are taking today? And there, what we are seeing so far still is a certain gap between these goals, the net zero goals, and the current plans. And this is where we want to link those longer term goals with immediate action. We need to be very conscious, and the message here is we will not get to those medium-term goals unless we take immediate actions and decisions today. Another aspect regarding the net zero pledge has to do with the fact that seeing not only governments, but also private sector, cities, civil society, different kinds of entities making these pledges is absolutely crucial, because we know that the fulfillment of the goals of the Paris Agreement are not going to be possible only by the action of governments. Governments, yes, they have a central responsibility. They also have a central responsibility in creating the environments in which all those entities within their countries can make the transformation that is necessary. But governments cannot make the transformation for anybody else. The capacity of governments to act on the field is limited. as powerful as governments are, and they are, right? But in this regard, it's extremely important. It's there, or communities, it's there where the transformations need to take place. So what do we need to see? Yes, we need governments at all levels taking decisions to enact the right policies, to have the right legislation in place, so that then businesses can make the right decisions, will do the right decisions, so that businesses can really have incentives in order to become, for example, to move from fossil fuel energy sources toward renewable energy sources, that businesses can move towards a much more sustainable way of operating in all areas. If you, no matter whether it is water, it is waste, it is the use of raw materials. So it is absolutely crucial. Governments alone will not make the transformation. We need everyone on board.
One of the most important things to remember as we're trying to move the world off of fossil fuels is that fossil fuels are causing very real harm and damage in people's lives today.
Anne Hitt is the campaigns director for the Sierra Club, a US grassroots environmental organization. Anne led the Beyond Coal campaign for 10 years, which successfully closed 2/3 of coal-fired power plants through community activism and advocacy. Paul talked to Anne to learn more about their work to end fossil fuels in the energy sector.
They are creating smog that is triggering asthma attacks in kids. They are spilling coal ash into rivers and spilling oil onto beaches. They are fracking and contaminating people's drinking water. There are pipelines running through people's communities. You could go on and on. And so people are very motivated when they realize there's a threat to their children or their health or their community. People are very motivated to get involved. And I think sometimes we forget, as we're working to tackle this challenge of the climate crisis, that we're not just talking about benefits for our grandchildren. We are talking about cleaner air today, cleaner water today.
It's very hard to argue against your children being able to kind of breathe properly. But it's pretty direct. It's pretty kind of in your face, as it were. I mean, does it affect how polluting companies respond to your campaigns when presented with the human cost? What can you say you've learned? And this is a real area of fascination for me. What would you say you've learned about how companies respond and how it's best to interact with companies?
Well, in our experience, there are a couple of different, in the Beyond Coal campaign, a couple of different main companies we have interacted with. The one is the electric utilities. And really what we are calling for from them is to make electricity in a different way. So they looking ahead, they make long-term plans about how they're going to generate electricity, and we're pushing them to move towards 100% clean energy. And every time they make a decision about whether to invest in a coal plant, whether to build a gas plant, whether to expand their clean energy, they're making a very big choice in one direction or the other. And so with those companies, we sit down and we're just very clear about what we're working towards, and we want to know how can we help them get there? And if we can't help them get there, then we might have to campaign against them and hold them accountable. But to make that shift and to do that shift in a way that makes sure that low-income communities and communities of color don't get left behind. So that's the conversation we try to have with those electric utilities. I think the coal mining companies, and I live in West Virginia where we have a lot of those coal mining companies, that conversation I think is about taking care of their workers, their responsibilities to their workers, taking care of the communities that they have profited from for many generations, and not just pulling up stakes and leaving folks behind as we continue to move away from coal, but to live up to the responsibilities they have to their workers and to the communities that they've profited from for a long time.
The fight for clean energy doesn't just end when pledges are made. Ordinary citizens are often the ones who step up whether born activists or not. The point is that we have the blueprint in the form of the Paris Agreement, and in the past 5 years, the technologies we need have proliferated. The voices of youth, indigenous people and activists have been incredibly important on the ground and at the government negotiations during previous COP meetings.
There's a very important role for activists to hold them accountable when they're not doing what the climate science demands or not even doing what they have publicly said they're going to do. We just actually released a report in January grading every single electric utility in the United States on just whether it's actually on track to live up to the commitments it has made around climate and emissions. And a lot of the electric utilities did not get a very good grade because they're making big promises about 2050. But in this decade, they don't have retirement dates for their coal plants. They're still building gas plants, and they're not building enough clean energy. So holding them accountable and calling that out is an important role of advocates, as other folks across the environmental community are also working in partnership with them and working to move things forward. But advocacy plays a really key role. Wherever you live, you can get involved and you can push those decisions in the direction of clean air and clean water and clean energy and a safe climate. And I have seen that in the Beyond Coal campaign. I have seen a grassroots movement over a decade reduce our use of coal from half of our electricity to 20% of our electricity in just a decade. And we have helped usher in this clean energy era that is creating lots of economic opportunity and is saving thousands of lives. And so that is the kind of progress we can make when people get involved wherever they are. And that's what we need more and more people to do in this very critical decade ahead.
Now, you are the most brilliant activist, one of the most brilliant in the world, well, with your fantastic organization. Now, tell me, is activism something that only appeals to certain kinds of people and not other kinds of people? Or have you learned that anyone can be an activist? What turns people into activists?
Anyone can absolutely be an activist. I know some people who are much more reluctant activists. Sometimes it happens when a threat lands on your doorstep. Here in my little community in West Virginia, there's a Danish company called Rockwool that's trying to build an insulation factory that would be fueled by coal and fracked gas. And people have come out of the woodwork in this community because they don't want a heavy polluting industrial facility built here. It literally would be a few hundred meters away from an elementary school. So moments like that make people activists when they realize there's some sort of threat on their doorstep or in their backyard. But I also think that when you look around the world, well, let me say this another way. When there is some problem out there in the world that you just can't stop thinking about, you just keep thinking somebody should do something about that. Like, why is it that kids are hungry? Why is it that our air and water are polluted? Why is it that our climate is spinning towards a point of no return? And you think somebody should do something about that. Maybe that person is you. Listen to that voice inside of you that won't let you stop thinking about that, because maybe that person is you, and you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a scientist. You don't have to be an economist. You don't have to be a politician. Whoever you are, wherever you are, with the tools you already have, whether you're an artist or a teacher or a young person, you can make a difference just listening to that little voice that says somebody should do something about that. Maybe that person is you.
Hello?
Nigel, it's Tom. How you doing?
Hi, Tom. I got a very strange. It's an international call, 0888888888. I thought that's very dodgy. I probably shouldn't answer it.
I'm calling incognito. It's my way of doing things, as I think you probably know.
Yes.
Listen, I think it's so... Nigel Topping, great friend of this podcast, high-level climate action champion for COP26, is a neighbour of mine. But he's also a tricky man to get hold of at the moment. And so I'm calling you. Where are you right now?
I'm in Nairobi in Kenya, and you can probably hear I'm sitting outside. The cicadas are going mad, but I'm having a really interesting week on the ground, all COVID secure, but looking at a lot of the issues around accelerating the energy transition and the EV transition and the race to zero in a very different context than at home in the UK. So I've just been launching with UNEP a great program on electric motorbikes this morning, and then tomorrow we're talking with a lot of private sector people and the Treasury and the central bank around how to accelerate private finance. So, yeah, really interesting.
Fascinating. Okay, great. So I asked Nigel a very simple question. Why is the race to zero so important now?
I think everyone, we need to remember that the IPCC report, the scientific report on the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is only 2 years old.
Yeah.
And that really triggered a massive shift to us all realizing we've got to get to zero by 2050 at the latest, not later in the century. So, and that really started to pick up last year when we launched the Race to Zero in June last year. And at its simplest, it's just about getting the whole of society in a rigorous way, and we'll come back to that, to commit to getting to zero by the 2040s at the latest. And increasingly we're seeing people saying 2040, 2035, 2030. And that means businesses, investors, cities, states and regions, schools, universities, sports clubs, because when they do that, not only does it mean that they're driving momentum, but it also sends a political signal to policymakers that, oh, look, the whole of society is committed to and moving, so we can be bolder and work with society so that we get that feedback loop of ambition going faster and faster and faster. And it's crucial now because of the pivotal nature of COP26, which will be the test of the Paris Agreement. Are we capable collectively of ratcheting ambition to live up to the promise of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah. And that's the big test. And it's so interesting. I mean, you're absolutely right. That IPCC report from 2 years ago just changed the game, because before that, we thought that, 2 degrees was a bit worse than 1.5. But now we know it's just, night and day in terms of the impact on people and livelihoods and ecosystems. So we have to do everything we can right now. And where you sit, like right in the middle of all of this global momentum, do you think that there's an understanding of the scale of change needed from amongst the sectors and the groups that you deal with?
I think it's really hard. I just think because humans are cognitively not wired to really understand what radical transformation is going to be like. We know that cognitively we're anchored in our experience in the recent past. So I think we're getting a better understanding of it. But just today, Volvo have announced they're going to stop selling combustion engine cars from 2030. And a few years ago, if I'd have said to you, Volvo is going to announce in 2021 that they'll stop selling combustion engine cars in 2030, most people would have said, I'm taking drugs. Because it just seems so far-fetched that something as fundamental as the technology, which has been our motive force for the last 100+ years, is going to be gone in 10 years. So I think it's our inability to imagine radically different futures is often one of the biggest barriers, sometimes more than political will or technology or deployment of capital. Our ability to imagine very different futures, until you can imagine it, you can't design it. Until you design it, you can't build it. Until you build it, you can't use it. So I think we're going to have to get much better at imagining radically different futures.
Yeah, and do you think people are doing that now? Because it's kind of around now, isn't it? People can kind of sense that there's these two futures that are in front of us. Do you think that the regenerative future, the one we want, is sufficiently coming into view to kind of drive change and get people to latch onto that and see what's possible? Is that happening yet?
Well, I think at different paces in different sectors. I mean, that's one of the reasons we launched the Race to Zero Breakthroughs, to try and make sure that we accelerate to that point where you can believe in that future in every sector. I mean, you can believe it in the renewables now because of the scale of deployment and the costs coming down. I think I've just been this morning at the launch of an e-motorbike initiative, which United Nations Environment, who are based in Nairobi, have launched with partners from the private sector and local manufacturers and Chinese manufacturers. And the city of so I think that the fact that people were able to see park rangers driving electric motorbikes around meant that that's very believable to everyone now. Like, oh my God, what do you mean they're only $200? Only $200 cheaper to buy and way cheaper to run. So that what they call the boda taxi drivers, the taxi drivers who take you on the back of their motorbikes, they will make more money by taking on the back of their electric motorbikes. The park rangers love them because they can sneak up on people who are poaching or stealing logs. So once you can physically see it, then it's not a question of imagining it. It's just going to happen so fast. But in other, we've seen it with like the impossible foods, some of the new alternative proteins. Until you've tasted one of those burgers, it's hard to believe that it's possible that it will ever compete. So there is something about getting to the point where something's been invented and is out there and you can actually touch it, see it, feel it, taste it. But then when that happens, I think things could go really, really fast.
The only thing that really matters now is time. History will look back at the 2020s as the most decisive decade in human history, the period that we're living through right now. The choices that we make, the choices we're making, will determine the future that our generation and all generations yet to come will inhabit. There are encouraging signs, but the rubber's going to have to hit the road a lot quicker if we're going to win this race.
We are still a million miles away from enough ambition or enough momentum, and I think the UNFCCC report is a really stark reminder of that. As you say, it doesn't include the realization of all the recent commitments. So the States and China, which we expect to see their much more ambitious NDCs in the next few months. So so the situation will improve by the time we get to Glasgow. I think then, and of course, it only includes national commitments because it's a multilateral process. If you overlay the momentum we're seeing in the real economy, which is a mixture of investors, cities, and businesses, on, for example, that transition to electric vehicles, which we've talked about so much, you can be very confident that that's going to happen much quicker than, on average, is included in NDC. So you've got a bump up from what the national plans say because they don't capture the pace of that the economy is going at right now. But even if you add all those up, we still won't be on a 1.5 degree trajectory. So I think we can be hopeful that at Glasgow we will very significantly bend the curve to be on something much more like a 2 degree trajectory, but we need to keep on the pressure and keep ratcheting to get down to being on a below 1.5 degree trajectory.
So that's a lot to take in, but in the spirit of outrage and optimism, we also wanted to ask our guests, on a scale of outrage to optimism, where do you fall?
I'm feeling really optimistic on the race to zero and mitigation. I'm feeling less optimistic, but working on it, on resilience, which has had not enough attention and needs to be mobilised much more. And the area that I think I'm least optimistic that needs the most attention is the mobilisation of global finance. And I don't mean there just the 100 billion commitment from global north to global south, which is crucial because it's a promise that must be met. I mean that we really need to turn the conversation to the 4 trillion, which is what the World Bank estimate needs to be mobilised in total every year to the investments in mitigation and resilience in the global south. And most of that's going to have to be private sector money. So we need to make sure we're talking about how do we leverage that in. Otherwise we win on the 100 billion but lose the war, as it were. So yeah, that in race to zero, really optimistic. Race to resilience getting better. The race to trillions, I think we've got a long way to go.
That's Nigel, mentioning also the race to resilience and climate finance, 2 massive areas that we'll be discussing in much greater depth later on in this series.
I just have such a deep belief in the power that we have at our fingertips to transform the world in the next decade.
Anne Hitt.
And I know it's not going to be easy, and I know the forces opposing all these changes we need to make are powerful, but I think that the creativity and the determination of grassroots folks around the world is more powerful. I think the people who are fighting for the safety of their kids and their families and the places that they love is more powerful, and I think we're going to do incredible things together over the next decade.
And Patricia Espinosa.
I think I am both. I am very concerned, but I am also very optimistic. I am very concerned because what we need to achieve by COP26, which is now only about 8 months away, is really very, very much. We need to build a comprehensive package of decisions actions, of outcomes that reflect the interest of all countries, of all these multitude of realities around the world. And that is not an easy task. But I am optimistic because we have the solutions, we have the resources, because we have the pathway. We know what we need to do, and we are seeing also at the international level some very encouraging signs. So we stand ready to work together, really hand in hand with everyone, to be able to increase that ambition and come forward out of COP26 with a positive message to the world. We are on track.
So how wonderful at this point in this critical year to get this chance to talk to all these amazing people. And I just have to say, listening to them all, I just have such gratitude for them being right in the heart of this complex and difficult process. And it's a long road still till Glasgow, right? And we know what it's like to be in those jobs and how hard that can be. But I mean, we should all be grateful in the environmental community. We have brilliant people who are leading these processes. What do you guys leave those discussions with? What have you come away with?
Yeah, I'm also filled with gratitude since we have, stood in their shoes. We know how stressful this is to be 8 months out of a COP and know that so much has to be done, that you still have to reach out to every single country, to every sector, to every company, the outreach that needs to be done, and in order to find that force that is going to bring everyone to do more than they currently think that they can. That's the mental shift that needs to occur from now until then, because these reports that we talked about at the beginning, they're really devastating.
Yeah, they're desperate.
And we absolutely have to get out of that MO, out of that mode of operation. So we first have to change people's hearts and minds to understand that may be where we are, but we have to step up. We have to get to a much, much better and deeper level of commitment over the next 8 months. I was heartened to hear from Alok that in his travels, he has seen that all governments want success in Glasgow. And they know what success means.
Yeah.
So they all know that everyone needs to step up. I think the commitment to stepping up is actually going to come from the governments, because they will recognize that there is so much civil society, private sector, investor, financial sector, corporate engagement. And I think, as we saw in Paris, once that is recognized, that governments are not doing this on their own, that they're actually benefiting from a lot of push forward from everyone else, what we called in those times the surround sound effect. I think once they recognize that the surround sound effect is here again, they will be able to step up in a much more courageous way.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you girls, but here's what I think. I'm really drawn to the comments last week by Dr. Catherine Wilkinson on our show, where she spoke of multi-solving for our entangled crisis. When I see such talented people together, when I see such positive indications with the new Biden White House, committing the US to not just being back in the game, but helping to use the geopolitical power of the US to pull us forward. I think anything's possible, but it is all about us in this year bringing these ingredients. They cracked open the eggs and we got the whatever, or the vegan equivalent, and the stuff's in the bowl and we're stirring it, right? But we in this year, we really have to deliver a beautiful, fantastic dish based upon collaborative, good culinary intent. We have no time to muck up in this kitchen, because the world is hungry for a result.
Paul, that was quite an analogy for someone who has no idea how to cook and who never cooks.
Yeah, I'm also confused as to what this vegan egg thing that Paul's making is going to do.
Someone's going to be like a vegan egg billionaire, trillionaire, by the way. So just like keep an eye out. There's some food scientist now is like making eggs out of peas, and I'm telling you, they're going to do very, very well.
Eggs out of peas. Okay, that's.
I eat burgers made out of peas, by the way. I eat Beyond Meat burgers. They're delicious.
Clay's telling us they're delicious. Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Oh, wait a minute. What about the Impossible Burgers?
Oh, yes, exactly.
Can't leave them out.
It's Beyond Meat and Impossible, two fantastic brands. Impossible Burgers, a
Thank
superb
you.
company, which I believe has managed to have the incredible good fortune to become associated with you, Christiana.
Exactly.
We shall delve more into Impossible Burgers, which I know is a favorite topic of everyone on this podcast. But I just wanted to say also, and I'd be curious to know your reflections, Christiana, but I see so much in the things we talked about today that is sort of the grown-up version of the sort of, early seeds that we were involved in years ago. And it's just so interesting to see how these brilliant people have come in, taken this forward, made it so much stronger, built momentum. It's really heartening to see how that process of the international engagement as well as the non-state actors just builds and gets stronger and deepens and gets more mature and more complex. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I see so many similarities, right, of the process that we built toward Paris. I see so many similarities. But as you say, it is a bigger, better version of what we built for Paris, in part because we have 5 more years or 6 by the time we get to Glasgow, 6 more years of experience, but also in part because the moment needs it, right?
Yeah.
Because we now have so much more science and we're so much more apprised of the urgency with which the transformation needs to take place. So given the fact that the demand for action is so much greater and so much more, let's call it overwhelming, it's actually good to know that the supply of leadership is stepping up.
Yeah. For sure.
And just in part of that, let's not forget, the extraordinary acts of kind of civil disobedience in different parts of the world that have been a necessary part of raising awareness, from Extinction Rebellion to Jane Fonda, getting arrested on Fridays for the Future. I mean, that's real integrity. Millions of school children have been on strike to alert their parents to the fact that they feel they're being exposed to unacceptable risk. I mean, these are completely unprecedented actions in the history of the world, and they're all contributing to the enormous sense of concentration upon this year. So, yeah, I mean...
Well, I was thinking about that when we asked the President-Designate how certain he was that we would have a COP26 in person. Will we be able to come in person? And
that was before the interview, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, which is why I'm summarizing now, Tom.
Thank you for summarizing. Please
so
continue.
When we asked, yes, please, I was trying. When we asked the President-Designate how certain he was that we might be able to come to COP26 in Glasgow in person versus on Zoom. And clearly they're devoting a lot of time to planning exactly that, because Zoom meetings or any other technology meetings are great, but there is a huge component of just personal interaction that is absolutely key to any negotiation. So he's very determined to make that happen. But I was also thinking, does that mean that by the time COP26 rolls around, and hopefully before, we will be able to see young people back on the streets? Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could actually have that civil disobedience back on the streets as well?
Absolutely. Now, I know we're going to have to wrap up in just a sec, but I cannot resist, Christiana, before we sign off. You have been in those seats. You've been the person who had the buck stops here written on your desk in the lead up to Paris. If you were sitting in that seat now, would you be feeling outraged about our lack of progress or optimistic about our chances?
As you well know, Tom, we were, hit by really bad reports the whole time that we were preparing Paris. And so the fact that these 2 last reports are such a deep hit should not take us by surprise, because we know that this is going to come. So what do we do with that information? we double down.
Yeah.
We double down and we go something that begins with SH, and then we go, and therefore we are doubling down on this. There is no way that can then let us sit back or cower back in fear. This is absolutely the moment to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and double down on the efforts, because we have to do this. Failure is not an option.
Love it.
And I don't think you meant shyness, Christiana.
I don't think so.
And I understand our social media channels are going to be taken over by a group of young people on Friday, the 19th of March,
Yay.
who will be campaigning for, how can I put it? It feels kind of weird to say self-preservation, but it's pretty good reason to be passionate.
Life. How about life on this
For
planet?
life. Campaigning for self-preservation. It's quite a thing to campaign for. Absolutely.
I demand my right to exist.
It's continue existing. All right, friends, this has been fun. First Race to Zero episode. Listeners, there is more coming your way. We really hope you've enjoyed it. We have really enjoyed pulling this together. This is the year, as Christiana said, we've got some bad stuff coming at us, but that means this is the moment to double down. We have everything to play for in this critical year. We got some great people driving us forward. Let's get behind it. Let's make it count. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
So there you go, our first episode in the Race to Zero series. How are you guys liking this music? It's good, right? Thank you to Mally and the team at Phase Music for this amazing remix. They did both the original theme song and the remix that you're hearing right now. And as you hear it more, you'll pick up like these little details they masterfully mixed in. I think we should actually have Mally on to explain a little bit about it and talk through it. Anyway, amazing work. We are jamming to this music in our Zoom meetings. It's really fun. So thank you. Okay, but on with it. My name is Clay. I'm the producer of this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If this is your first time with us, welcome. It's so good to have you. Every week, we publish an episode surrounding the outrage and optimism both needed in the climate crisis. And you can join us here by hitting the subscribe button. And in between now and our next episode, we have a full catalog of episodes out for your immediate podcast binging needs. So whether you listen while doing the dishes, while out for a walk, or while you should be working, no judgment here. Those episodes are available to stream right now. Enjoy. Okay, Outrage and Optimism is a Global Optimism production. Our executive producer is Sharon Johnson, and this episode was produced by Daniel Curtis and Clay Carnell. Global Optimism is Sarah Law, Katie Bradford, Laura Richardson, Marina Mantilla-Herman, Sophie McDonald, Freya Newman, Sarah Thomas, Sue Reed, and John Ward. And our hosts are Christiana Figueres, Paul Dickinson, and Tom Rivet Karnak. Thank you to our guests, the Right Honorable Alok Sharma, MP, President-Designate of COP26, Executive Secretary Patricia Espinosa of the UNFCCC, Sierra Club National Director of Campaigns, Mary Anne Hitt, and of course, our friend and sometimes co-host, high-level climate action champion for COP26, Nigel Topping. I'm really feeling the energy of this song as I'm recording this. You can join our guests on the road to COP26 by checking the show notes for links to all of their social media pages. And we've included some searchable hashtags for COP26. Just go check it out. It's very nicely organized. Okay, this is the part of the podcast where I tell you what you already know, which is that this podcast is available on Apple Podcasts. But what you might not know is that when you leave a review, we read it. Your reviews have started making their way into our regular weekly brief for the show, and sometimes they even make it on the podcast. So it helps so much to spread the word about our show if you leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. So thank you. And last but certainly not least, we are online and posting about it. And by it, I mean Stubborn Optimism. Intrigued? At Global Optimism on all social media channels. Give us a follow. Send us a message. We have more episodes in our Race to Zero series coming. We'll be releasing about once a month or so keep an eye out for that. But next week, another episode of our regular Outrage and Optimism format, so hit subscribe, and we'll see you then.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Race to Zero!